thanks very much for tuning into this episode in our Frontiers of Research podcast series. My name's Tony Lockett. I'm Head of Communication at the European Research Council Executive Agency, and I'm here today with two of my very nice colleagues from our scientific department, Eleni Zika and Anne Nielsen. They both work in our sector that's responsible for feedback to policy. And we're here today to speak about a new report which is coming out, which is about frontier research and democracy. So Eleni, Anne, hi.
Hi. Hi. Thanks for the invitation, Tony. Yeah. Thanks for the opportunity.
Great. Well, it's great to talk to you. And congratulations on this new report. It's one in a series of reports that you're putting out on different themes connected with frontier research. And perhaps you could just start by explaining, what is feedback to policy and why is the ERC involved in that?
Yeah, sure, with pleasure. Feedback to policy is newly delegated activity to our program, not only to our program actually, but to all bodies that implement parts of Horizon Europe. And the notion of feedback to policy is about bringing closer the results of the research that is supported by the framework program to policymakers so that they actually can be informed better about the design of future programs and making sure that they close the gap between science and policy design. So this activity was delegated to us officially with the start of this new framework program, Horizon Europe, and we have put it in place in a rather structured manner through the development of a dedicated team in our agency that works on that. So what we're trying to do is actually trying to extrapolate from our portfolio and the research that we support as an agency, as an organization, the results that can be pertinent for policy reflections. And we try to do this in a manner which is systematic and planned and anticipative, and also fits actually the needs of policymakers who have very clear priorities in their minds very frequently, also reflecting very urgent societal needs and challenges.
And what are some of the other themes you've been looking at? I mean, this report is on democracy, but what are some of the others that have already come out and some of the other themes you're going to be looking at?
Well, we're only in the second round of implementation of our plans. We have been working on the basis of annual plans. So we're only running our second one just now. Last year, we published a report on sustainable food consumption and production, actually on the request of the European Commission. This was actually our very first feedback to policy report. It was, in fact, developed and delivered in record time, 6 months after our first plan was adopted. And I thought it was very successfully taken up because it was referenced in an independent scientific opinion of the Commission on the same topic. And actually fed into a joint ERC STOA event.
Can you just explain for our listeners what is STOA?
Yes, absolutely. So STOA is the Scientific Technology Committee of the European Parliament. I think I'm not getting the acronym very well. But basically they are an independent body of the European Parliament that issues also scientific opinions and advice on different matters related to policy. So we were very glad, and it was very timely in fact, that our report could help and feed into the design of that event with STOA. Yeah.
And as our listeners, at least those who follow the ERC regularly, will know that ERC is all about bottom-up, curiosity-driven research. So how does that fit with this idea that the ERC is providing feedback to policy?
Well, actually, I think because we are bottom-up entirely, we are giving our scientists tremendous freedom to work on any topics that are of scientific importance, but also topics which can potentially derive solutions for key societal challenges. And I think what is important and an opportunity with us with this feedback to policy activity is to bring the outcomes of our projects to the policymakers in a more structured manner. And those outcomes are already out there, and many of our grantees are actually already serve as policy advisors, if you like, in different fora. So we make sure that we give more visibility to that, and also we present in a more structured manner. So And we've done that not only with food recently, but also with other topics that are very topical, like biodiversity, which built on work that looked at our contributions to important policy reports like the EPES assessments, for example.
So there's no contradiction in your view?
No, there is no contradiction. In fact, what I think is a very rich asset of the ERC as a bottom-up program is that it can actually inform policy making in many different areas without having the anticipation of working on this already. The ERC-funded researchers do this work anyhow. And so
I think the word is serendipity, isn't
serendipity,
it?
exactly. So in fact, we precisely want to tap into that serendipity and make sure that the outcomes of that work is reaching policymakers properly.
Okay. Thanks, Eleni. Maybe, Anne, I can turn to you because you were the lead author on this report on frontier research and democracy.
I was.
So congratulations. It must be a relief somehow that it's out. Can you tell us what was the thing that surprised you the most as you were collecting the examples and doing your analysis? Did anything really stand out for you?
Well, I think tipping into the discussion about the curiosity-driven research and how it manages to actually always provide, frontier research results on very pressing societal issues. It's one of the things we found also with this portfolio analysis on democracy. And I think maybe one of the surprising and positive discoveries was the breadth of the research in terms of the disciplines it covers. There's, of course, the usual suspects of political science and law and sociology and economy, but then you also actually have a number of projects on anthropology, ethnography and cultural studies that are also looking into issues related to democracy. And if I may, just maybe one example is one project called Artivism. It's led by Monica Salzbrunn from University of Lausanne, and basically what they do is they look into how different types of art expressions are used as a political means of expression in terms of resistance, mainly by citizens living in repressive regimes. And so they're analyzing both street art but also comics and other types of art events and how it's used as a means of political resistance, actually. So, it's a very broad, I would say, portfolio of projects that in very different ways address issues linked to democracy. And I thought that was really fascinating to see.
And I think I saw in one of the charts in the report, there are even projects from physical sciences and engineering.
Well, we do have projects, of course. So these are particularly projects linked also to computer science and also to, because we have a lot of projects that are actually developing quite concrete tools to see how they can counter the spread of fake news, for example, how they can detect bots better. And different tools that are actually in real life time manage to identify fake news as they appear. So that's, yes, we do cover really a breadth of fields in this report.
And you mentioned the term portfolio analysis. Can you explain just a little bit how you managed to identify these 200 plus projects that somehow touch on democracy?
Sure. It's now that we have been doing it for a number of different portfolio analysis, we're developing some good complementary methods. So one thing that we do is that we use the internal classification system that we have, where all the scientific officers that are in charge of following the projects, they note down the different disciplinary fields they cover, the methods they use, the topics they work on, and so we can use these classification to identify the correct portfolio. But we also use free keyword search in either the abstracts or the full proposals of the projects to maybe narrow down a bit the search for specific areas. So then we combine those two methods, and we feel quite certain that we get a quite precise identification of the relevant projects. Then in the end, of course, we work together with the scientific officers in the scientific units who help us go through actually all the projects, and we analyze all the abstracts, and we see, are these actually then correctly identified using this classification method and the keywords that we used. And that, of course, takes a little bit of time depending on how many projects you have, but it's really, really a nice exercise as well, because you get to read through all these really, really interesting projects. And then we also, together with the scientific officers, we figure out which one of the projects we then want to highlight in the reports, because of course we can't showcase all of them. It's we don't have the space for that, so we have to select some of them, which normally we try to see which one of them are more advanced and maybe have results that we can highlight in the reports.
And you mentioned your favourite. Perhaps Eleni, do you have a favourite from amongst the projects in the report?
There are so many, but I can't pick out one. But what I wanted to say, as a life scientist myself, I was particularly impressed by the breadth and the originality of many of these projects, coming from domains which I was not very familiar with myself. So I think as a read for a novice, this is very fascinating. And as a policymaker, I think you'll find a lot of interesting information that perhaps you wouldn't think that a program like ERC would be supporting. And in fact, we should not forget that in social science and humanities today, we are one of the driving funders, in fact, in Europe. So I think this is also a very nice highlight. And if I may add a small point to what Anne was saying about portfolio analysis, I think what is very interesting to highlight also in today's conversation together is that these reports do not only refrain the scope within the description of the scientific landscape, we are actually trying to make connections with policy areas. We try to present this work in the light of a policy framework. So we're going a little bit further, and that's a novelty for our organization. And this is also, I think, where there's a lot of excitement today internally for this kind of work.
It's obviously extremely topical with the European elections coming up in June, but also many other elections taking place across the world. But I wanted to zoom out a little bit and ask you about how easy or difficult it is to interest policymakers and politicians in research outputs. You mentioned in the case of your sustainable food report, it was actually the Commission that came to us at the ERC and asked for some input. But, is your impression that we're knocking at an open door and that there is a lot of interest, or is it more challenging and you have to kind of lever the door open sometimes and get the ear of the policymakers?
I must say, the experience we've had so far is that there's so many requests and so many people knocking on our door that we can't simply meet them all at the same time.
So that's the challenge.
The challenge is really being able to respond adequately, with quality and with depth to the different requests that we receive. So we've tried to systematize our processes and our capabilities so we can do this at a greater scale and faster. But I think it's very encouraging that people want to know, at least in the policy sphere that we are interacting with, so mainly the European Commission.
Right, so the famous bubble.
The famous bubble of the European Commission is certainly interested and excited to know what is funded at the frontiers of science and technological development. So I think this is a place in which we are very blessed to be. And I think we are now in a position to provide that feedback more readily and make sure that this feedback is actually taken up properly, so at least it is visible. So this is what we're accomplishing with our collaboration with SAM, but also with the Joint Research Center.
SAM is the Science Advice Mechanism,
exactly,
right?
That's right. And also with the Joint Research Center, which is the Science for Policy service of the European Commission. We're actually very closely working with them to be sure that our work is also taken up by their work. So we're trying to build these complementarities, hopefully effectively.
May I give an example actually from this report?
Please do,
because it's not so long ago that we also had one of our PIs, our researchers, Michael Brüter from London School of Economics. And he himself also mentioned, and I know this well, that he's been working, for example, with DG Justice to help provide some information and insights into how maybe elections can be designed in a manner that is more inclusive to people who otherwise, for different reasons, would not be participating in elections. So that's like one of the things. But more broadly, in terms of this report, I had the chance to then speak to the colleagues in DG Justice who are working on elections and who are working on citizens' rights in that regard, and also actually there in charge of this whole democracy action plan by the Commission, and they're very interested to see what it is that the ERC funds on these different matters that they're dealing with, be it political advertisement or also the detection of fake news and its impact, foreign interference, for example, in elections in Europe. And things like that. And also, as Eleni mentioned, the Joint Research Center, they're also working on democracy. Yeah. And they're also quite keen on learning what our researchers are working on. So I think, there are open doors and there's huge interest. And it's really nice, actually, to be able to share this amazing research that we fund.
Yeah. We do, by the way, have another podcast interview with Michael Brüser, who you just mentioned. So if people have found that interesting, they can go and listen to the great detail about his work on in that podcast. But you mentioned that you were impressed by the breadth of the research that's being carried out by grantees that relates to democracy. But how about the different research methods that they're using? Is that also rather diverse?
It's very diverse. Again, there are some things that are typically used. There are case studies, there are interviews, there are surveys that are used to a high degree. And in the report, we actually also show a bit what are the most used methods by the projects. But I think for me, some of the ones that are more interesting are the ones that stick out a bit from the usual suspects. No? So again, I would say that there's been also a bit of an increase in the use of digital methods within anthropology and ethnography as well, that do very interesting research also to see sort of behavioral on digital platforms, for example, which I think is very interesting as well.
And when you say digital methods, can you give an example or be more specific?
Well, so basically it's some of them is about to see how people interact on digital media, and how they behave basically on digital media. But another one we have, for example, is on how data and access to data and digital sort of, if not behavior, then activism can actually be used as a tool among citizens to also engage in democracy and actually take ownership of data, because there's a lot of talk about, of course, how there's concerns about data privacy, for example, among citizens. But here it's turned a bit on its head, and we have this project that looks at how can citizens actually use digital data and access to these as a tool for increasing their own participation and their own sort of engagement. So I thought that those are the things that stroke out to me as quite interesting in terms of the methods that are used.
And I imagine that any researchers that are looking into people's behavior online and using data from the platforms must have to be very careful to respect ethical standards and so on, because there have been a number of cases where people have taken liberties with personal data. So that's something that the ERC takes rather seriously, I think, isn't it?
Indeed. There is a quite extensive and thorough ethics evaluation, of course, taking care of these issues and supporting the applicants and what they should consider when they carry out different forms of research. And in the report, there's an analysis done by one of our colleagues working in the ethics unit that has tried to identify what are some of the major topics that researchers on democracy have to consider then when they carry out this research. And there are basically two main things that came out. Besides, of course, there's always the concern about data protection, but there are actually so many good systems for protecting that now that it's become not so much of a concern as it might have been. Two of the other things that are striking is, the involvement of vulnerable populations in research. This can be, for example, migrants, or for some of the projects it can be minors, for example, or it can be people with disabilities, or people where you have concern about their ability to give consent to participate and things like that. And the other one is about the place that the research takes place, because much of this research also looks at democracy and democratization processes, not only within Europe, of course, but actually also in conflict areas where there might be concerns about the safety of the researchers taking place, also the local researchers taking place or participating in the research. So those were the two main sort of highlights that they found had to be taken into consideration.
Well, Anne, Eleni, it's been really fascinating speaking with you. Congratulations again on the report. Perhaps before we close, is there anything else that you wanted to mention or share, either about this particular report or about the work you're doing on feedback to policy?
Well, I wanted to thank you also, Tony, for giving us a chance to talk about this. It's a new activity for our organization, for which there's a lot of growing enthusiasm actually internally and externally. Those who receive it are actually keen to have more of. And maybe to make some kind of heads up, not warnings, but announcements about what's coming up. So in a month's time, we'll be publishing a similar report, a very comprehensive analysis on artificial intelligence. And within that portfolio, we show a lot of linkages as well with the democracy one. So it was, from a portfolio perspective and feedback to policy perspective, it's very nice to see these bridges across issues and across domains. So hopefully we'll be addressing that more in the future.
Super. Thanks so much. So watch this space.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you. Great.